Okay. Yeah, should I start then and then we go through the thoughts and question? Okay. Um, all right. Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okie dokie. Okay, so first of all, what I'm going to show builds on a couple of assumptions and things that we kind of talked a lot about before. So, but just to state them explicitly, it assumes that we have two types of models in each column or learning module. One is an object model, which models features at locations. That's what we currently have implemented in Monty. Um, and then we have the behavior model, which uses the exact same mechanism, but it models changes at locations in a sequence. Both model types have a unique reference frame for each model instance. So each object model has a unique reference frame and each behavior model has a unique reference frame, and they're independent of each other. And both model types can be recognized at arbitrary location, orientation, and scale by applying transforms to the incoming movement vectors, and like post-dependent features as well. So like, yeah, basically rotating the incoming movement and features to transform them into that unique reference frame. And then both model IDs and changes of those IDs can be associated hierarchically on a location by location basis. So the model ID and pose can become a feature at a location in the higher level object model, like the logo can become a feature on the cup. And then also model ID and pose changes can become a change at a location in a higher level behavior model.
Can you just leave this screen up for a second while I read it? I don't want you to go on.
Sure.
All right, so this is one of the things we'll come back to perhaps, is it wasn't clear to me that the behavioral model has to have a feed forward projection. And I think that's what your second bullet point here at the bottom is saying. Or maybe not. Model ID imposed change. Is that the behavioral model there?
Um, so at the higher level, this would be the behavior model. So at the second level, we have the behavior model, and that one only stores changes as by the
Yes,
definition up here.
yes.
So that one only stores something if the model ID at the lower level changes. So for example, if the logo suddenly changes from one logo to another, um, I
But
have
yeah,
a
it's not necessarily behavior that's being passed up.
It says
So
the
like
change
it's just a change in what
becomes
yeah,
is represented in the
change.
low level column.
Okay, all right.
it's like if
All
a
right, all right, all right.
feature
So basically,
changes.
those two bullet points are kind of the same thing, then, right? They're basically saying, oh, you have a model ID imposed, and that model ID imposed can change. Is that
Yeah, it's
no?
basically
Yes,
analogous to the top 2
yeah, they're
points.
kind of mirroring these two. So basically, this is the main rule I'm following with this, that object models only store static features.
I
Behavior models
understand
only
those 2
store,
points.
yeah, and
I got
then
this. It's the ones at the bottom. You added some more words, and I'm confused by what you're saying there.
so now
Uh,
at the bottom one, I'm thinking of the higher level learning module or column. And there, the first bullet is basically the object model at the higher level, which stores features which can, in this case now, be child object IDs. And then the second bullet corresponds to the behavior model at the second level in the hierarchy. And there, the changes that it stores don't just have to be changes of low-level features, but they could also be changes of the child object ID or
okay,
pose.
so
Like if the logo rotates or
right, all right.
if the
So that's a
logo
bit of
changes.
confusing. I mean, are you just trying to say there that? I mean, I've always viewed that anything can change in the model, anything as part of a behavior. So the ID of the child could change, the orientation of it can change, its scale can change, its position it can change.
Yeah.
Is this saying anything more than that, or is this just saying you just spelling that out? I'm
It's not at odds with that at all. It agrees. Well, basically, I'm just saying that we learn we can learn hierarchical models on a location by location basis, and how which information goes into which higher level model is dependent on whether it's changing or not changing. I maybe it's
You're
obvious, and
muted,
I
Jeff.
didn't need to take that
Yeah, there
again.
was a lot of words in there, and that it wasn't obvious that's what you're saying. That's just basically saying it's the same as the first two bullets then, or almost the same, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the same as that, but I just felt like it would be useful to state it again because, at least in my mind, I was a bit confused about that in the beginning, trying to think about like how do we learn hierarchical behaviors? Are the behaviors made up of other behaviors? But I feel like now it's pretty clear to me that no, behaviors at higher levels are still just changes, and they could be changes in the object ID or the object orientation or changes in the behavior ID. So it's not like it remains like a flow of behaviors hierarchically composed, but it's more
Right,
like
right.
even at a higher level, it's behavior models are
Yeah,
only changes.
yeah, maybe like a clarifying point is, which yeah, seems to be kind of what we're converging on, is like behavior is not passed up as a feature.
Hey,
But
it's interesting because last week, that was one of the things you proposed. You showed the behavioral model being passed into layer 4. And
Yeah, so it
and I
is
comment
past.
on that, but I kind of concluded that didn't make sense this last week. So are you saying you're also sort of abandoned that?
No, so I would still say that the behavior ID is passed up as a feature, but it becomes a feature on the higher level object model since it's a static feature. It's not something that's changing. And that's how we assign behaviors to different locations on an object.
Okay, well, we'll come back to it because
but
I'm not.
I guess if a
I'm
behavior can be a static ID, then it can also change. So I don't know, you could
Yeah,
imagine the stapler goes from its opening closing to its
yeah,
on
maybe
fire or something. Uh,
maybe
but
I'll just go to the
yeah,
next slides because I
yeah,
show examples
Right, all
exactly
right,
of
because
those things.
okay.
So
these are a lot of words,
yeah,
and
this is a
and
very
it's
text-heavy
and
slide.
it's
So
hard for me. I think I understand this stuff pretty well, but I'm not on. The words are confusing to me.
yeah, maybe I'll just go to the concrete examples. Um, okay, so here's the basic mechanism again, just showing it to have the new way of showing it um, explained once. So we have a sensor, the sensor senses movement and features, and those get transformed from the body's reference frame into the object's reference frame. And then they go into the lower level learning module or column, and the movement moves you then through the object's reference frame. So you're like, you might be thinking you're in the middle of the logo and then a movement arrives and now you expect to be, I don't know, up here. And then the feature is then like either laid down here when you're learning or compared to what's stored there. Um, and that way you can do inference. So in Monty, for example, during inference, this transform, there are multiple different transforms we apply, basically testing several hypotheses at the same time, saying, okay, the object might be in this orientation or that orientation. So I orient the movement in two different ways and see which one matches with my model. And then once we actually recognize the object, we can just apply only one transform and keep making predictions in that model's reference frame. And so the model of the object is features at locations. In Monty, this is locations in Euclidean space.
So I see you sort of abandoned the sort of literal column interpretation here, right? This is what you were referring to earlier. Like you don't show the thalamus or the layers of the cells and so on.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if that works for other people. I find it a little disjarring because we've been looking at the other images for so long. Now I'm looking at this image and I have to sort of interpret it. So I'm just giving you my personal opinion about that. Other people can speak up on their own. Maybe this is helpful for other people. For me, it's a little bit harder, but maybe just because I'm so used to the other way.
Yeah, I just tried to boil it down to the conceptual mechanisms that are happening. I mean, you could say that this little black dot is the thalamus or is a relay cell in the
Yeah, but
thalamus.
yeah,
So,
I got all that. So maybe,
and then,
it'd be interesting to hear from other people who are not as familiar with the neuroscience, whether this is easier. Um, I just wanted to point out that, it's not making it easier for me, but it's okay. I can deal with it.
It's
Um,
easier for me.
yeah,
Okay,
I think it's pretty clear, but
all right, that's good.
yeah, I guess I'm trying to make it a bit more Monty-esque right now, to draw that comparison.
I got it.
But yeah, we can switch between the two. I still try to keep kind of the spatial arrangement the same. That this is like the object orientation is down in layer
Yeah.
6, and
I'll stop, but to me, like the column diagram is like a circuit diagram, right? It's like looking at a chip, and you can see where the information flows, and that's helpful for me. This is much more conceptual. There's blobs and things are just sort of relating to each other without real connections. But I'm good. If it helps other people, then we should keep doing it.
Um, I think it helps from the perspective of describing what is, but it is absent of all the constraints that help to inform any future discussion of what ought to be. So, for the purpose of, it's missing constraints for the purpose of exploring alternatives, but with the constraints being absent, it's straightforward to explain what is.
Okay, but that's good. That's a good input then.
yeah, and I'm not saying we should keep this way of showing it for the future when we brainstorm and stuff. I was just trying to simplify it a bit to explain the mechanism. But yeah, I guess one simplification I made here is that instead of showing the object model as associative connections between layer 4 and layer 6, I just showed it as an object model, which is maybe a bit more how it is in Monty, where it's like a kind of like a point cloud of feature points at locations in 3D space, or a graph kind of. So yeah, basically this blue box would in the circuit diagrams be this associative connection between locations and features. Yeah, so then if we take two of those learning modules or columns and we stack them hierarchically, we have a lower level one and a higher level one. First of all, something that we assume is that they are co-located in space. So both of their sensor patches are at the same location. It's just that the higher level one has a larger receptive field. So both of these actually can get raw sensory input and movement information, and they kind of move together through space. But then, since it's a higher level column, it also can get input from the lower level learning module or column. And there the input is basically the pooled object ID. So it doesn't get any information about this object model that is learned here. It doesn't get any information about that structural graph or point cloud or model that was learned. It just gets information about this object ID. And this object ID then can become a feature on this object. So we would then, for example, say, okay, here and here and here at these locations, the logo exists on the cup. The logo is a feature on the cup at these locations. And then additionally, we want to tell it the orientation of the logo relative to the cup. So we can take the orientation of the logo and the orientation of the cup and calculate the relative orientation and also store that at these locations. So each of these points in the model of the cup would then store, okay, at this location, there is a cup feature, and that also has a relative orientation. And this is in Monty today. So object ID and pose are the CMP output of a learning module, and they become the input of the next learning module. And as they become the input of the next learning module, they get processed exactly the same way as this input gets processed, which means that the object ID then becomes a feature at a pose in the higher level learning module. And so this is how Monty is today.
That
Um,
really helped me. That was really good.
Cool. And then one thing that's not yet in Monty, but on the roadmap for kind of completing modeling compositional objects in Monty is the feedback signal, which is if this column has recognized the TBP cup, it wants to tell this column to expect the logo at a certain orientation and to expect on a certain location on the logo. So basically, here we get again the constraints of the neuroscience that come in. If you are just coming from an engineering perspective, you might think of a different solution. But basically, how we think this happens in the neocortex is that this TBP cup learning module that recognized it or column can send a feedback signal, which is kind of like a context signal for the lower learning module, which this one can then associate with the logo and the location on that logo and the pose to expect the logo at. So basically, this one doesn't know anything about the logo itself. It doesn't know the structure of the logo or where on the logo this column here is. It just knows I'm detecting a cup, and so then this location on the cup, which is unique to the cup, can be sent down, and then this one can associate that. Okay, whenever I'm getting this specific signal from the high-level learning module, I am at this location on this logo. It's kind of like a coincidence thing that always happens. Whenever I get this input, I am here and I'm sensing this. And so that can then kind of when this one hasn't recognized the logo yet, bias it to recognize that.
I think you said this, but it's worth reiterating, I think, that this feedback is not for the cup, it's for a specific location on the cup. And so in this particular case, the patch in the higher level module would be actually on the logo area of the cup. And then it says you should be seeing a logo in the lower region. It's tempting because at one point you said, oh, it's context for your, but it's that feedback changes location to location.
That's a good point. Yeah, I should have kind of drawn it a more explicit dot. So basically, like you said, there's a location that we are on the cup, and then that biases a specific location on the logo. And since the two receptive fields of those two are co-located, those will always appear together when the sensor goes over the cup. So they can form this one can just associate, okay, whenever this column sends that particular location. I don't know what it means. I don't have a model of the cup, but whenever this column sends this, I am at this location and orientation on the logo. It's not just like voting where it's like, oh yeah, whenever you sense the cup, I sense the logo kind of thing.
Another way to put that, if you were looking at a different part of the cup, maybe on the bottom or the handle area, it wouldn't predict the logo at all. It wouldn't say anybody. Only when your eyes move or your sensor moves to the area where the logo actually is, then the lower level learning module says, oh, there should be a logo.
Yeah.
And I guess, yeah, one thing we might implement when we're adding this to kind of mirror the anatomy is columns that this one might not be exactly co-located with. It can still more generally predict the presence of a logo. And that would be the equivalent of the L1 connection, the kind of spreading axon terminal point. So that you, in the context of this diagram, you're kind of both predicting a specific location in a specific low-level learning module, but you're also kind of saying, okay, I'm a high-level column, so I see a wide receptive field. A lot of these other columns that are lower down should be seeing the same object since I'm seeing this object, or since I'm at this location, rather.
Yeah.
It's funny, that spread in layer 1 that you just referred to, it's not something, it's actually super required. It's something we just observe and we can explain. But, if I would design this from scratch, maybe I wouldn't have predicted that. I would say, yeah, I just need to know point by point what should be predicted. But it definitely would help with noisy input and obscured and, and voting and all that kind of stuff. The key point is that on a point by point basis, as your sensor moves on the cup, it predicts different things in the lower level learning module.
Yeah, and I assume like how wide that spread on in L1 has an influence on columns can kind of depend on how predictive the signal is for a particular object. So if the logo is rather small, then that spread might be small because the further away columns don't, it's not predictive for those, so they wouldn't form a connection to the signal. But if it is like bigger logo, then it might have more columns that are further around there that would connect to the signal.
Well, the physical spread would be the same, but which synapses are formed? It would only form synapses if there was correlation.
Yeah.
So is there, are we associating a single position in the higher level column with multiple positions in the lower level column? Or is it, because we have only a single position for the logo in the higher level column, if I understand it correctly. But these are sending feedback to, it will be sending also to a single position in the reference frame of the logo in the lower level. So is it, are we associating with multiple positions in the lower level or also a single one?
Just a single one. So it'd be one location on the cup associated with one location on the logo.
But that would normally happen multiple times.
Yeah, so
there wouldn't just be like a single association, but when an association is formed, it's between one location in each reference frame.
yeah, so same as the logo exists at multiple locations on the cup, each of those locations on the cup can then also have a backward connection here and kind of bias different locations on the logo. But each connection itself would be a one-to-one connection, right?
And that, yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Ronnie.
I was just saying, how does it bias multiple locations on the logo if, like, wouldn't it need to have associative connections to multiple locations on the logo on the lower level to be able to bias the different locations?
But that's the thing, we only want it to bias one location in the logo. So there's just so it's a one-to-one mapping. Like if we're at a particular location on the mug, then we're at a particular location on the logo. But and then in case this helps, like in terms of how many of those one-to-one connections we form between them, it kind of depends on how complex the compositional relationship is. So if it's something really simple, like a small logo on a flat surface or something, it might just be a couple connections are sufficient to kind of describe that relationship. But if it's like the logo with a 90-degree bend or something like that, then you need more associations to know, given I'm on the mug, where am I in the logo space, and also what is the orientation of the logo or the child object.
So maybe a follow-up question. As we move with the sensor on in the lower level reference frame, does the location in the higher level reference frame change, or does it stay the same?
It changes. I mean, the sensor is moving in both reference frames. The only complication, which we could try to avoid for now, is that if the two columns have different inherent scales, like the size of the locations are bigger in one than the other, then it's not exact one-to-one match. But if you just assume that they're the same, then as you move the sensor, it moves in both the logo, the lower reference frame and the upper reference frame the same, they're co-located constantly.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah. I try to show that a bit with those, like the pink arrows, basically, they both get the same movement input because they're moving together. So if one changes the location, the other one will as well.
It might be useful. I don't know. I find this fascinating that to think when you look at something like this cup, your eyes are constantly moving around and attending to different things. And every time you move around, it makes a prediction what should be there. Like you would predict, oh, there should be the logo, and now there should be the word 1,000. And if I focus on 1,000, it predicts there should be an A. So you're constantly bouncing around between objects and their features, and it feels seamless to you. It feels like you're just looking at this cup, but in reality, is you're constantly looking at the hierarchical arrangement between features in a large object, and it could be like it just feels, it's just a seamless. Oh, you say, oh, I just know there's a logo there, but you'll know there's a logo there because your eyes move to that location, or you're anticipating moving to that location. Then there's a logo. I find this process fascinating in terms of your mental thoughts, what's actually going on as you're moving your sensors. it feels like one thing, but it's actually bouncing around all the time between these two different models.
Yeah. Yeah, any other questions on this one? Okay, then now to behaviors. I don't have to go into too much detail again, but it's basically the same image here, but the big change is that we get movement and changes instead of movement and static features as input. So whenever the sensor is actually detecting a change, that gets routed into the behaviors reference frame, and then we store changes at locations. And I didn't show this in this diagram because I didn't want to make it more complex, is that there's also like a temporal component. So, I mean, that's indicated by this being an animation. So there are changes at different locations, but also at different points in a sequence.
So just to be here, to be clear here, the fact that it's already a change, like the difference computation occurs pretty far upstream, like at the level of the thalamus, right? There's no difference being calculated at the level of the cortex, or no?
Yeah, I think it's a bit mixed evidence, like where, for example, direction selectivity emerges. Like in some species, there's direction selectivity very early on, even retinal ganglion cells, but then also like layer, I think 4B alpha is also kind of either extracting or getting directional selective input. But I think it's generally quite early on, so I would put it in the thalamus as like a general rule of thumb.
I'd say even earlier. I mean, if you go back to the idea that there's these two basic types of outputs of the retina, the parvocellular and the magnocellular, and they have different response properties. You know, one responds quickly and one responds slowly. So one could argue that the quick responding ones are detecting change, and the slow ones only become active when something's not changing. It becomes static. So the idea you have these center surround receptor fields coming out of the retina, they're divided into some ones that are best detecting movement and ones that are best detecting static patterns. It occurs there. And then in the cortex is where it gets converted into, oh, this is an edge moving in this direction or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a way of putting it is that like some of the input is better suited for one versus the other, but then like the place, like you said, where it gets actually a bit more interpreted as like this is moving in this direction versus that direction, is then like combining a set of center surround cells. Hey,
This is Jamie. He's about to go to school.
hey Jamie,
Bye-bye.
have fun at school.
I do not remember going to school that young. Okay, well that makes sense to me. Yeah, it makes sense that. So I guess what I was trying to think of is like the feature is like kind of a little bit higher level than something that's just motion. At some point, feature, it's just a little more complicated than
I don't know
just
if this is important to the discussion today, but the way I view this is you start off with these very simple, imagine these center surround fields. Some are detecting changes and some are detecting static, things. And these are just a center surround receptor field that just detects anything that's not uniform. That's what they respond to, anything that's not uniform. And so then this ascends to the cortex. The thalamus, there's very little evidence the thalamus does any transformation on this. So it gets to the cortex, and very quickly it's converted into things like mini columns that represent edges or moving edges or things like that. So that would be an output of a spatial pooler. So you start off with raw bits like changing bits and static bits, meaning these things there's some sort of change occurring at this point, or there's some sort of a non-uniformity that's changing, or there's some non-uniformity. And then in the cortex, it figures out what to represent. It's not clear to me that the idea that there is directional sensitivity that's determined by the cortex. It's not determined by the retina or the thalamus.
Yeah, and then maybe getting, and I'm not sure if that's where you're getting at, Scott, with your question, but I think like if you're thinking of extracting change at a higher level, like if the object ID changes or your object orientation changes, that could be using the exact same mechanism of like basically in the cortex detecting small temporal offsets of where a pattern changes. And yeah, basically the same mechanism you use with the on-off cells.
Jamie's saying
Are you going
goodbye.
to stay with Grandpa?
Now he's saying goodbye. I'm Skipper. I'm not Grandpa, I'm Skipper.
Oh, okay.
Bye, Jamie.
But yeah, does that make sense, Scott?
Yeah, it makes sense. I have some kind of thoughts or questions about like the memoriness of things that receive magnocellular versus parvocellular, but it's not really pertinent to this conversation, so I'll just hang on to it.
Yeah, it's also something I want to read a bit more into and talk a bit more about. So maybe at a future meeting or later we can go into more depth on that.
Yeah, in general, I have a kind of backlog of a few papers on kind of optic flow and movement detection that I've been meaning to read. It could be an interesting topic for a kind of a session.
Yeah, I also read a couple on that last week, so I could also I should probably send a brief summary in what I learned last week. But yeah, anyways, back to the general mechanism. Somehow we are extracting this different movement information and storing these changes in the reference frame of the object behavior. And the same way that we convert movement and features from the body's reference frame into the model's reference frame, we do this here to get into the behavior's reference frame by applying the behavior orientation to that input. And so if we were to implement this in Monty, it would be pretty analogous to what we do for object models. Basically, we would be laying down points at locations. So like kind of, we call it graphs right now, but it's really more point clouds because we don't use edges right now. But basically, instead of at those points in the graph or points in that reference frame, instead of storing static features like color and whatnot, we would store changes at those locations. And then we would need another dimension basically for time. So storing like a graph of changes for each step in a temporal sequence. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, how those ways of thinking about this solves particular problems we've been talking about. So now I'm just going into the new solutions I presented last week. The previous ones were kind of included in the last slides already, but basically one of them is we want to be able to associate objects and behaviors. So if I see a stapler, I want to know that it has a certain behavior. And also if I see a behavior that might bias what object I think I'm perceiving. So the proposal I made last week is that we can associate those by using hierarchy. So we have, in this example, a behavior model in the lower level and an object model in the higher level. Here we have a hinge behavior and a stapler. And then this hinge ID, the behavior ID, is one of the outputs of this column that becomes a feature in this object model. So we would then do this again on a location by location basis. So each of these circuit locations on the staplers could be associated with this particular behavior as a feature at that location. plus the orientation of the behavior, the relative orientation to the stapler, using exactly the same mechanism that we would use if this was like a child object. It's just a child behavior. It's just, again, a feature at locations and relative orientations at those locations. Does that make sense?
What does this model give? Because like the other thing we've discussed is where it's the reverse, where the behavior model exists at the higher level and the morphological model is at the lower level.
So that way around, I was proposing as a solution for predicting morphology, but this way
Yeah.
around, assigning behaviors to objects, because like we mentioned before, usually behaviors, like the object is the larger thing, and the behavior applies to either the whole object or parts of the object. The behavior is never bigger than the object itself, so it makes sense that it is the child of the object model.
Are
But
we,
I guess in this instance, why does it's not clear to me that it needs to be across columns or yeah.
Oh, because of the relative orientation calculation here, I think that makes it easier, and because we want to do it on a
Yeah.
location
So-
basis.
is this an okay time to delve into more complex, confusing topics, or do you? I guess, because I have an issue with this too, and I wrote up this alternate example, which I could talk about, which suggests maybe that the behavior isn't in the lower column. Should I reserve that to later, or should I dive into it now?
Yeah, if you want to
So,
bring.
okay, all right. So let me in the little write-up I put last night, I gave an alternate example. I said, imagine we had a cup with the logo on it, and the logo rotated. Okay, so it's just like we had before, but now the logo rotates. Behavior is magically the logo on the cup rotates some 30 degrees, and then it rotates back. In this example, it's different than the stapler. In the stapler, we have the confusion where parts of the stapler are moving and parts are not. In this case, the thing that's changing is just the logo. The logo itself isn't going under any behavior. It's just presented at different positions relative to the cup. So now the question is, okay, I can learn this. Where is the behavioral model of the logo rotating on the cup? Is it part of the logo, or is it part of the cup? If I were to say it's part of the logo, it's so like the logo could be just rotating on its own, or and I would just compensate for it to our thalamic mechanism we have. And I wouldn't necessarily say that's behavior. I would just say the logo's got a different orientation now, so there's no behavior associated with it.
Yeah, so I think I'll have a slide on that, not with this specific example, but basically, since in that case the relative orientation is changing, this would become an input to the behavior model here. So we have
But the question is, would there be a behavioral model in the lower level column?
No.
All right, so there's an example where there isn't a behavioral model. You're not relying on one, at least, in the low level column. And then I asked myself, well, could that be the way to think about all these situations? And then I said to myself, well, if I think about the stapler, imagine the stapler is like the cup, except the top of the stapler is the logo and the bottom of the stapler is the cup. Okay, so now I have a part that's a separate component that's moving relative to the other components. It's not self-contained on the cup like the logo is, but there's one part that's stable and one part that's moving. And so that's very analogous to the cup on the logo. And then I said, well, do I need a behavioral model in the lower level learning module? And
Yeah,
I said, I don't think I do.
I would say in that it's a bit of a different example because the logo is on the cup is already a compositional object, so we already need composition to model that. And then you have the child object change relative to the parent. So if I would draw this up, I would probably draw 3 levels if I would want to show it all. But I would still say at the lowest level, there is a behavior, which is just the local optic flow that's being detected by the sensor. But it doesn't say any, like it's not related to the child object itself changing its orientation. It's
But
just,
is that a learned behavior or is that just a moving object? It's just like, okay, so I have an object that's moving. Okay, it's rotating, but is that a
Yeah.
behavior that I'm gonna associate with something?
yeah, I would still say like that's a general behavior model of how bits are changing if something is rotating.
Well, that could be, although I was working on the alternate hypothesis, and I don't know which is right. The alternate hypothesis is that the staple example is confusing because we have the same object, it's parts moving and parts not moving, and the idea that the logo on the cup could rotate is a simpler one. And I didn't feel like yet that I needed to introduce any kind of behavioral model associated with the logo. It's just that it's a feature on the cup and its position is changing, but the cup could learn that. And the stapler, just the way to think about the stapler is imagine if immediately, as soon as I see the top moving, I isolate the top. Like imagine I have a morphology model of the stapler in the lower level column and the higher level column. They're both there. And as soon as it starts moving, I'm only going to focus on the top of the stapler on the left column. So and now it's like a logo. All I'm doing is attending to the part that's moving and ignoring the rest of it. So now it's just immediately I split this into 2 parts. And on the upper column, I'm going to be anchoring to the logo. On the left column, on the upper column, I'm going to be anchoring to the base of the stapler. On the left column, I'm going to be anchoring to the top of the stapler. And now I'm just back into it's just like the cup and the logo again. So I think the staple example was very difficult for us to get our heads around. But I think if I think of it the way I just described, it's pretty simple then. It's just like a logo changing on the cup. And then I asked myself, well, why do I need to have, a model of behavior in the lower column? It's just that the feature in the left column is just changing its position relative to it's just, but I don't necessarily learn to lead the behavior there.
To me, like why I put it like this hierarchically is because it seemed so analogous to compositional objects, because the parent object might have different behaviors at different locations and orientations relative to the parent. So like I had this animation of the mailbox where you can open the door of the mailbox, you can put that little signpost indicator up and down. You can do it like one object can have many behaviors and the behaviors are in different locations and orientations on that object. So it seemed like using the compositional object mechanism is like the perfect fit for it.
I agree with that. I mean, I'm not suggesting abandoning the compositional object mechanism.
But yeah, I was just going to say, I think it might be possible to do it within a column because like I can't right now come up with an example where like, at least as far as I remember, one of the big reasons why we model composition objects like that is because the child object might change its orientation and scale midway. So we need to do this like very dynamically, but I'm not sure if there are good examples of where the behavior would change its orientation.
I don't want to abandon that. I think it's hierarchical. The question I'm asking is very specifically, we have these 2 models. We have the morphology model and the behavior model. And what I'm suggesting is like in the logo on the cup example, we have a model of the logo and we have a model of a cup, and we're positioning the logo on the cup in different positions and changing in orientations. We're keeping all of that. The question now is when that relationship changes, such as if the logo rotates, or the logo changes in some other way, or some other feature of the cup changes, where's the actual behavioral models that's describing that change stored? It could be it could be associated with the left column, which case in the logo example would be, oh, logos rotate. And so, there's a behavioral model of something rotating, or it could be on the upper, the higher learning module, which is saying I have an object and some part of it is rotating, some part of it's changing.
Which it kind of feels like it has to be since it's relative to something. It's like if it's just rotating, then relative to what?
So the little,
Yeah, I mean, I think, or
go ahead. I was just finishing up. The thing I wrote last night was trying to get at the heart of this thing, which is that if I can think about, this whole thing is just a series. We have compositional objects. In fact, every object we've ever created in the system is a compositional object. Sometimes the child features are very simple, but they're all compositional objects. And now what behaviors are is that the features that comprise the compositional object can change in various ways. And they can change their ID, they can change their orientation, they can change their position, locations, and so on. So that could all be stored as part of like, I have a compositional object called a stapler, or a compositional object called a cup with a logo. And I now need to keep track of how the features change on that compositional object. And that would suggest it's in the right column, not the left column.
well, yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I think in terms of like discussing hierarchy, it's also useful to think even the lowest level column is in a sense a hierarchy relative to the incoming information from the sensor modules, from the kind of
Well, I would say it's
subcortical
compositional.
stuff.
It's compositional, right?
Yeah, but even in that case, it's compositional. It's like it's features at locations.
Right. I
It's
wouldn't
just the
say
features are even
hierarchical. I would
simpler.
say it's compositional. It's
Okay, yeah. So
like,
it's but it's always compositional. So I think you could argue, like in the case of the stapler, like we can learn a model in multiple levels of columns. You can learn the stapler kind of the inefficient way in terms of like all of this local feature changes happening at many different locations, or you can learn it and represent it more as a compositional object where it's like it's the top of the stapler that's moving. It's the same mechanism. One requires the former requires more neural representations because it's lots of different changes being represented.
right. Right.
Yeah, that's a good way of phrasing it, I think.
So I don't have a very strong opinion about this. I'm just pointing out that when I think about it, the way I've been thinking about it, it's not clear to me that we need to use the behavioral model in the lower level column in this example. It might be. It's not clear to me you have to do that. That's all. Because if I have a behavioral model on the left side, it's going to be a behavioral model of the top of the stapler. I mean, because that's equivalent to the logo on the cup, right? The logo on the cup isn't. It's just an object on the cup. So the object itself has to have this behavior. The logo would have to have a behavior of rotating or moving, whereas I could describe that as, every time I see the logo, maybe I'm going to imagine it rotating, but maybe every time I see a cup, I imagine the thing on the cup rotating. So
Yeah, so I think maybe actually the next slides will help a bit, because I'm also not saying it needs to only rely on this there. Like we would still have like a behavior up here for the stapler, which is much more rich than this one down here. This behavior is really just local, like optic flow or like local bits of changes, whereas the behavior in the top level column really represents like, oh, the top of the stapler is changing its location and orientation now. So like there can be two behavior models, or there would be two behavior models, and at least how I'm thinking of it, and the top level one would be more rich.
I get that. I understand it. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with it. I'm just questioning, do we actually have to have the lower model behavior like that? Would it be sufficient that the behavior model is only in the stapler model?
You probably don't need it. I don't think I would say we need it in all cases. I guess I'm just trying to illustrate a mechanism, and maybe in this example we wouldn't need it if we have learned the behavior of like the top moving relative to the stapler model. But
I think I would also find it helpful to just kind of work through, what in terms of this representation, kind of what that helps us predict. So, because it's not about predicting morphology, so it's presumably about predicting like feature changes.
So basically, so what I'm trying to achieve with this is associating object and behavior. So this one I showed so far is basically learning. So we learn that on this location on the stapler, the hinge behavior exists. So then when we see the stapler, this kind of backward context signal can bias down here to expect the hinge behavior. So we know, oh, there's a stapler, I can like push it down and open it and close it without it actually moving at the time. At least that's, yeah, the main benefit I see in it.
So if the morphology of the child object changes in a way that we cannot represent it as change in orientation with thalamic transformations, that would require us to build behaviors in the lower level column. Like, for example, if the top bends, or the top of the stapler bends or something like that, we cannot represent that with change in orientation relative to the higher level column. And we'd have to learn that as a behavior of the lower level object.
Right. An example of that would be, imagine you have the logo, and every 2 seconds, 2 of the letters on the logo swap places. Okay.
Right.
So there's a behavior of the logo. And wherever we have a logo model, that behavior would have to be represented. So it wouldn't be, you wouldn't be able to represent that as part of the mug. It's because it's not the mug that's doing that. It's it's not a mug behavior, it's a logo behavior.
Right.
I think that's what you're saying, Ron.
Yeah. So so I think that the transformations that like a change in orientation that's happening in the thalamus, it's very limited in terms of what it can represent as a behavior in the higher level column, like something that changes orientation.
I don't think the thalamus is learning anything along behaviors. I think the thalamus is just doing a transformation of orientation. That's it. It
Right.
has no capacity to learn.
But I mean, these transformations are very limited in terms of what kind of behavior we could learn.
Yeah, and that's kind of what
I disagree with that. We can learn anything, right? Can we learn any kind of change?
Well, I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with that open question of like, how do we represent changes in locations instead of just changes in relative orientations? So how do we represent that locations of part of the object are changing?
By the way, I can't, it's hard to imagine any example where the locations are not changing at the same time as orientation. Like in the stapler top, as it moves, locations on the stapler top are moving.
Yeah,
locations, right? So
yeah, but we would apply that transformation to the whole child object. So it's when we apply a transformation in the thalamus to a child object, it's applied to the whole object as with its child ID and everything. But if we want to apply,
but that's only sometimes, Rami. Remember the you know, we came up with examples where let's say the top of the stapler, as it went up, it bent in the middle or something, or you know, you can come up with all kinds of weird examples where even a change of orientation isn't applied to the entire feature.
yeah, but that's one example. That's one example where it would need to be in the lower level column as a behavior of the
well, maybe I'm confused by it. So I'm more expressing like I don't think we understand it very well, because I can think of examples where it's not obvious. Like this idea that the logo rotates on the cup, is that a behavior of the logo? Or is it just like, oh, maybe the cups rotate things? I can make arguments both ways. Let's say every time I saw the Thousand Brains Project logo, every time I saw it, it would rotate every 2 seconds. Well, then that, you know, so that seems to be a behavior of the logo, but relative to what, you know? It's like, because if I just rotate the logo, I can just compensate that with the thalamic mechanism. It's like, oh, it's just the object in a different position.
It would be more
Just
like
for what it's worth.
the behavior tells the thalamus when to compensate, like how to compensate the rotation. Like you don't have to re-recognize the orientation of the logo all the time, but instead the thalamus is directly told, okay, now the orientation should change in this speed.
Right. I guess I'm just trying to understand what are the behavioral models in the left column and what are the behavioral models in the right column. It seems to me if there's a behavioral model in the left column, it's it's gonna be fundamentally different than the one in the right column.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for what it's worth, the rotation and the thalamic transformation, if it's, I feel like it's helpful to also just kind of clarify that, like, although we are kind of robust to it, like invariant to it, like if you either rotate your head or you rotate the text, we can still read, but we are also aware of the change in orientation. You're aware that the line is at an angle, or that your head is at an angle. So
maybe I think
it's not
I
like because
think-
the thalamus is undoing it, that it like isn't visible to us.
well, like my head's tilted right now, and I'm not aware that, I had to ask myself, is my head tilted? Yes, it is. I would say what you become aware is if that thing moves relative to you. Like if I move my head, I'm less aware of it. But if the object moves, I'm very aware of it. It's like, oh, look, something's rotating here. Anyway, I'm just countering points, not because I have any fundamental belief, Niels. I think it's still confusing.
Yeah, I agree. It's still hard to know, like, where would you store that information? I agree, that's confusing. But yeah, at least the sort of the information, I guess, exists at some level. But it's like, if that's a learned behavior, how do you store that long term? That is weird.
Well, it's not the behavior is not going to be stored in the thalamus. It'd be
Right.
It's just like, I can imagine that the logo has a behavior that whenever I see the logo, it rotates. It's rotating relative to something, so it'd be rotating to a background that isn't rotating, or it's just maybe there's some parent object that it's just that's invisible in some sense. It's got a reference frame, and the position of the logo in that reference frame is changing.
Okay, it's just rotating relative to the body or relative to the sensor.
Well, but maybe, I mean, it's really relative to itself, because if I held the whole cup was rotated, then the logo would be at an angle and it would rotate, but not relative. The amount of rotation wouldn't be relative to my eye. It would be relative to the cup or its certain location.
No, I mean, I feel like a rotation of the logo it doesn't require a parent object. It's the same as the way that I'm able to recognize any object in different orientations. It's the same thing, same mechanism.
Right, but if I'm gonna say it's rotating, I mean, our definition of a behavioral model, behavioral object, is you've got a reference frame, and then there are changes in that reference frame. So if I want to have a logo that's rotating, I can't rotate the reference frame. I have to say, oh, the position of the logo in some reference frame is changing. Otherwise, I'm just inferring it at different angles. It's like, I can recognize the logo at different angles. That's not a behavior. It has to move relative to something. Like I need to have a reference frame that says, oh, the logo is now in its rotated position, and now it's in its unrotated position.
Yeah, maybe the next slide will actually. Maybe I can move on to the next slide, and it might help with some of these things.
Yeah, maybe.
So, because I'm talking now about actually relative orientation changes. So, and now also about behavior models in the higher level column. So basically, if the stapler opens, it's a child object that's changing its orientation. I mean, I know it's also changing locations, and it's a bit more complex than the logo on the cup. So maybe I should have used that example, but we talked
We
about
could just say it's like the logo on the cup. It's all right.
But basically, we have the hinge orientation changes relative to the stapler. So the difference between the orientation of the stapler and the orientation of the stapler top is now changing. So previously, when we just learned a compositional object, we just had a relative orientation and we would just store this in the stapler model. But now that is changing, this error goes into the behavior model reference frame. So now we lay down that change as a point in that reference frame. And so now this kind of high-level hinge behavior, or whatever you would call it, represents the sequence of changes in relative orientations between the stapler and the stapler top.
I'm confused. Are you, I mean, it's not the tabletop orientation is changing. it's on a location by location basis, isn't it? It's like I have to look at the orientation at each location. It's not like I can apply rotation of the entire top.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I'm thinking of like one time step, the sensors at a certain location. I mean, that's why in this behavior reference frame there are multiple points that are being laid down, but
Right.
it's just
So
illustrating.
technically here, as it rotates, the location, all the locations are changing. And if I go to one of the new locations, it's got an orientation which was different than what that same equivalent was before. But I
Yeah,
guess
so
I'm struggling with this idea that we can separate out orientation at all. It's just like there's an orientation at each location, and whatever it is, that's what it is, you know.
yeah,
But the
so I
orientation
just
at a given point in time will be common to the child object. Like assuming we're kind of attending to things that are moving together.
Well, right, but one of the big insight with the compositional models is that we have to do it on a point by point basis. That was the big insight, and we can interpolate in between points, but we can't assign an orientation to a whole component, a whole set of things. It's like it's on a point by point basis. We have an ID, we have an orientation.
Right, but it's easier when like the logo on the mug or the notebook or whatever can be learned much easier if it is a common orientation.
Right, but that's just because we can interpolate between points. And I don't need as many points, but it
And
is still
also,
point by point.
but also if they rotate in different ways now, like if parts rotate clockwise and
Right,
part
right.
counterclockwise, we would segment this into different child objects.
Yes, but but I'll say it again. There isn't an orientation applied to the entire child object. There's no way the brain would know that. It just knows on a point by point basis. There's this ID of a child, and it's at this orientation at this location. That was the big insight of the compositional models, you know. So
Yeah, so I don't think what I'm showing here is against that. It's basically saying we have a relative orientation between these two. Previously, we would store that in the object model at a location, but now there's actually a change being observed. So instead of storing that relative orientation at a location here, we store that relative orientation change at a location here. And that
what was it? Where was
change
the
could be
second one?
different.
Oh, and on the hint, the one that's labeled hinge.
Yeah.
You moved your cursor. I couldn't see where you moved it. Okay.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if
Yeah, I got it. I got it.
Yeah, so that relative orientation change could be different at a different location in that behavior reference frame. But
It would be a different location.
Oh, sorry?
It would be at a different location. I just don't see I don't think you can separate location and orientation out. You can't say the orientation's changing. It's like any point can have the behavior is at any point can have a new ID and a new orientation. Any
Yeah.
point.
I agree with that.
So this idea that we changing the orientation at the top, yes, that's you and I would say that. Mechanistically, we can't say that. Mechanistically, we would say the system's going to learn some points and it can interpolate between them.
Yeah, so I'm not talking about changing the whole orientation of the whole object down here. I'm talking about laying down one point in this reference frame, associating a changed orientation at one location.
Okay, well, the problem is the language we sometimes use is like, oh, we're changing the orientation to the top of the stapler, which implies that the orientation applies to the entire top of the stapler. Logically, in our heads, that makes sense, but that's not what's going on. I'm just reacting to that. And then the idea that somehow the orientation, we can change the orientations at some location doesn't make sense to me. It basically, you can't separate out orientation change and location change. There's no way you can do that. I don't see
Um,
how you could do that.
Is it maybe worth just clarifying again what we mean by location change? Is in
yeah,
the example of like something where like it can just move up. So like
because yeah,
these two
I'm
parts of an
not.
object can be.
I'm right now explicitly not talking about child objects moving location relative to the parent object, because that's kind of the big issue that I pointed out last time, and that I'll try to propose a solution for in the later slides. But I'm explicitly leaving it out here because I'm not sure what the solution is to that part. So I mean, when you say change at locations, do you just mean like different locations in this behavior reference frame have different changes in orientation stored, or do you mean whenever something changes orientation, it will also have like a movement associated with it through space?
Yeah, like you could argue this logo could rotate or on a point, or it could go up and down. In some sense, when it's rotating, there is kind of changes in location, but it's not like the location of the child object is moving.
This again, I think this is the big insight when we started looking at the logo on the cup that was changed. It had a different orientation in the middle or different shapes. Is that you can't think of it as a single thing. It's just a point by point thing, and you interpolate in between. So in this case, when I think about the behavioral model, imagine I have the behavioral, I have a morphology model, and then a moment later, the morphology model is changed because of behavior, right? So, you know, the actual positions of the features and their orientations in time one is different than positions of features and orientations in time two. You and I could say, oh, that's the top of the staple top moving or whatever. It doesn't know that. It's just a set of morphology descriptions that flow through time. And then what we want to do is learn a behavioral model that says, I don't know the specific details of what's going on here, but I can predict how the morphology model would change. I can predict what would be the new morphology model, you know, if I had to predict one. And I'm going to use the behavioral model to do that. It's just, I'm trying to get very abstract here. There's no concept at all in the higher level model of there's no assumptions about what the child objects will do or what they are or how they're going to move. It doesn't know anything about that. It just says, I have an ID, I have an orientation at this location at this time. And the fact that there is a child object that has its own reference frame and it's rotating, we'll take advantage of that, but the parent object doesn't know anything about that. It's not, it doesn't know that the top of its stapler is rotating. It just says at a series of times I have different morphology models and I'm trying to learn how to flow between them. This language is so hard to use.
I think I'm agreeing with everything you're saying. I guess just to double check, I mean, we're still communicating the orientation of the child object here.
No, we're not. We're
Right.
communicating the orientation of a child object at one location.
Yeah.
It's not the object itself. It's just at some point where I'm focusing or attending to on the top of the stapler, what is the orientation at that point? And what is the location at that point?
Yeah, but it's still the global orientation that this lower level column applies to the movement input it receives to move through
That is under the assumption that the lower child object is not changing, that it is a single thing that has a reference frame, and we're going to take advantage of that. But the parent doesn't know that. Parent doesn't know that there is a single thing that's moving. It's just detecting any kind of change.
Isn't that kind of the point though of like subscribing the breaking off the child object with attention? That it's like the higher column can kind of assume that it's one thing because the lower level column is only going to communicate at any given point about like a unified thing.
I don't know. I think I'm not sure how that mechanism would work. You know, I mean, somebody's clearly saying this thing is moving and I need to treat it as a singular object. But I don't know how that's happening. This is why I like thinking about this. This is why I went to the example of the logo rotating on the cup. It could avoid that whole issue, which we can come back to later and say, okay, well, how did it work in the case of the stapler where I had to break off a piece? You know, it's like, this makes it harder.
Maybe, yeah, maybe it makes sense to move on to the next slide.
Next slide.
Maybe it'll be easier to like talk about yeah, after the whole problem setup is stated. And
It would also be nice for you
that's
to
gonna
be able to get
also-
to the movement correction stuff, just so
Yeah.
everyone can think about that.
Yeah, and also I have a logo on a cup example on the next slide. So it's not rotating, but I guess in this, I just wanted for completeness to show learning feature changes. So basically we have the Numenta logo, oh, hang on. We have a logo on a cup. I don't know why it's not animated. Ah, here we go. Well, basically, yeah, I'll just show this slide. We have a logo on a cup, and the logo can change between the Numenta and the TBP logo. Oh, I think you're muted,
You're
Jeff.
muted.
So that's the behavior we're talking about. The little graphic is changing.
Yeah, so the logo on the mug is changing. So we have at a certain time interval, like each logo is shown for 2 seconds, and then it switches back and forth. So the low-level column can recognize both of these logos.
But
And
excuse me, is the entire logo changing or just the graphic? Are the words changing too?
No, just the
Just the
mark.
graphic, okay, because when you have this logo change over the N and T, I'm trying to figure what the hell it is.
Well, for simplicity, let's just say the mark, or I mean,
got it.
there's no text on the
I
mug,
got it.
whatever.
Okay.
But basically, there's this TBP end cup that has this specific behavior where the logo keeps switching back and forth. And whenever the logo changes, that means that kind of object ID feature that's coming into the higher level column is changing. So that needs to be routed to the behavior model in that case. And so that change between these two object IDs from the lower level column would be modeled in the behavior model up here. That model would basically learn the temporal frequency of when it changes back and forth and that it changes. And then this behavior can then also be used as like this feedback context signal for the lower LM to like know when to predict which logo at what orientation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts and questions about it.
Yes.
There's a lot of assumptions that unfortunately would need to be exposed. I can do that if you'd like.
But yeah, we only have 13 minutes left, I guess.
Okay.
If we're
Good.
going
So
to try
I'll
and
be
finish
quiet.
it.
So keep
Well,
going.
I'm just thinking, Vivian, if you wanted to get to the thing that you kind of had in
Yeah.
your document, because
Yeah,
then
maybe I'll get to that and then we can go back home again and think.
because then people can ruminate on it the next week.
Okay. All right. So last, just real quick, how could we use this mechanism to predict morphology during a behavior? Basically, the idea being that we have this behavior model up here that stores changes. So, for example, relative orientation changes of the top of the stapler relative to the whole stapler, and then this feedback signal could then be used as a way to inform the lower level column how to update the expected orientation of the child object. And if that expected orientation of the child object is updated, then again, all of the input for the child object is in the correct reference frame, and all the predictions about its morphology would be correct. It has a detailed model of the stapler top, so it can predict all of the morphological features of it. We wouldn't have to learn any keyframes or anything like that. We would just use this behavior to know when to how to modify the incoming movement vector to still be correctly located in the child's reference frame. So now you noticed already that all my slides just talked about orientation changes when usually there's also location changes, or in a lot of cases there are also location changes. And so currently with just compositional objects, not behaviors, location is encoded by assuming co-located receptive fields and then making location by location associations. However, now a child object can move relative to the parent, and that movement will be stored in the behavior model. The behavior model in the higher level learning module will need to update the object model in the lower level to update its expected orientation and location in the reference frame of the child object. Like what I just showed, we need to have some way for the behavior at the higher level to inform how we need to adjust the incoming movement vector so we correctly move through the child's reference frame and can make correct predictions about its morphology. It's relatively straightforward for orientation. Like I just showed, you can just kind of update that expected orientation in layer 6. But we currently don't communicate or store relative location changes of the child object to the parent. And so that's kind of the problem setup. And potential solution 1, which I just added at the end of the document, it's not my favorite, but I just wanted to put it out there first, is to communicate the object location relative to the body. So basically, similar to how we can calculate the relative orientation of the child to the parent, we could then, since they are both in a common reference frame, we could calculate the relative location of the child and to the parent, and then store that relative location for one in here, and you could then recognize changes in the relative location and store that in the behaviors reference frame. And it would be very straightforward to implement that in Monty as well. To get the location of the child relative to the body, you basically just take the location of the sensor relative to the body. The sensor location is already in body reference frame, and you add it to the location on the object, and you output that. So that would be a pretty easy mechanism. I could like implement that in Monty in a day. I say now, but I mean, it would be a pretty straightforward mechanism, but I think we had reasons why we didn't do this before. Maybe it would be worth revisiting, but I just want to get to the other idea real quick. So yeah, the second idea would be instead to rely on motion information from the sensor. So basically, this higher level module still gets the direct sensory input, and that sensory input will communicate also movement in the sensor's receptive field. And that kind of optic flow could inform location changes up here. And then those optic flow location changes could be applied to the child object's reference frame. And the big assumption this makes is that the high level receptive field is large enough to track the entire child object's movement. So, I mean, this is kind of something we talked about before, how like the biggest receptive field is to detect the movement of the sensor, like it's a global movement, but then if you have more local movement, that can indicate movement of the object itself. And basically this one would assume that like this movement of the child object would actually be like detected from the raw sensory input and stored in a high level learning module's behavior. And then to apply that motion, no matter whether we get it from having body-centric location information communicated or from the optic flow information, we basically have two scenarios. One is applying motion to, one is the sensor is following the object, and the other one is the object is moving through the sensor's location, so the sensor is static. In the first scenario, the sensor location relative to the body changes, so the sensor is moving, but the location on the child object remains the same. So it's always on the same location at the stapler top. In the second scenario, the sensor location relative to the body remains the same. It's not moving, but the location on the child object changes. And we need to be able to deal with both of those scenarios. So for scenario 1, where we're following the object with the sensor patch, we're basically getting movement input up here, but also movement input here to the higher level reference frame. And that movement would go into the behavior's reference frame to move through that behavior reference frame. And basically, I tried to indicate it with this red circle. As the sensor patch moves here, we are also moving in the behavior's reference frame. But in the child object's reference frame, we don't want to be moving. We want to stay on the same location in the child object's reference frame, even though our patch is moving and we're actually getting movement input. We don't want to move in this reference frame. We want to move in this one only. So how do we do that? One way to do it could be to take the stored location and orientation changes that are stored here and apply them to the child object's reference frame. So one for orientation, we can just adjust that expected orientation. But then more importantly, for location changes, we can apply that to the incoming movement vector. And in this case, they would cancel each other out. So basically, the movement of the sensor following the movement of the stapler is exactly the opposite of the movement that's stored in the behavior model. So we get exactly what we want, which is that we don't move in the child object's reference frame, even though the sensor is actually moving. In the second scenario, where the sensor is not moving, but the object is moving, we're actually not getting any movement input up here, but we actually want to be moving in the child object's reference frame to make the correct predictions of which features we want to sense at what point in time. We're also not moving in the behavior's reference frame, again, because there's no movement input from the sensor patch because it's static. But the sensor patch is detecting optic flow, so it can detect this kind of local movement, location change of the child object. And that would be stored in this model up here. And again, we can take the stored location and orientation changes and apply them to the child object's reference frame. So same mechanism to apply to the orientation, but then for the location, we again just take whatever location transform is stored in this model, we invert it, and then that becomes the movement input here. Since we don't have movement of the sensor, nothing cancels out. We actually are moving in the child object's reference frame, which is what we wanted to do. That's it. A little bit of a fast. But
Nice.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it'll take a while for that to sink in, but I think actually this worked well because last time you kind of gave a nice overview of everything up to now, and then it was kind of quick 20, 30 minutes at the end, the new ideas. It's kind of been similar today where we spent more time talking about last week's stuff, but I think the discussion we had today wouldn't have been possible the first time round. So I think there's a system here. I think next time we can maybe dig into these details.
It reminds me a lot of when we worked on compositional structure, which, if you recall, on and off, that went for years, but it was not steady. And we just spent so much time arguing about what the problem was, what problems we're trying to solve, and we kept introducing new complications that the solutions wouldn't work. And I think that's where we are here. My sense is that this isn't right yet, that we're thinking about this wrong. There's some things we're missing, and that the final solution will be somewhat more orthogonal or simple in some ways. but we're in the process where we're arguing the analogy to the compositional objects when we're saying, yeah, but the logo could bend, or, we could have, this on top of this on top of this. And, how do we understand, how many levels of hierarchy are there, and blah, 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 blah. In the end, we came up with a pretty straightforward solution. I think we're not there yet. I think we're still in the argument of what the hell the problem is. And
It does remind me a little of displacement cells.
right. Well, that was the simplest, completely wrong example we had, but it was the first attempt, right? Yeah. So as
Yeah,
always, it's good progress, but I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, I definitely think it's an interesting idea. And yeah, it would just be good to, maybe next time work through the details.
Yeah.
Maybe one high level observation I just wanted to make kind of before we wrap up, but I don't know, Vivian, if you can just show one of your slides again with like showing the kind of like animation of the movements and stuff. Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks. No, like that other one you just said. Yeah, thanks. I think it's maybe just worth kind of thinking about how at the moment, we talked a lot about how we don't want keyframes, and I think that's true. But in some sense, at the moment, our behavioral model is still kind of like a keyframe in that like we're learning changes at locations throughout time. Like it's quite a densely sampled model. If you imagine even just something as simple as a stapler open, there's going to be changes here, changes here, changes here, changes here. That feels like that kind of emphasizes the importance of hierarchy, maybe, that like if there's any way to do that efficiently, we can't represent like a bunch of tiny local changes everywhere. That it doesn't necessarily mean that it's just like one single object moving, but I don't know. Just thinking about that again, it feels like
the alternate solution to that is, and I keep saying is you have to interpolate. Interpolation has to work really well, because obviously anytime we have something which is not uniform, like let's say the top of the stapler breaks into 10 pieces and each one flips over or something, then you have to learn a lot more to learn that behavior. But when the whole top moves at once, you don't have to learn much. I don't think, to me, the solution to that problem is interpolation. That you can't sample all the points. You certainly don't want to for simple behavior. And somehow, so to me, the answer to this whole thing would be, I need to interpolate within the behavioral model. Like maybe I'm not going to store all the points in the behavioral model, but somehow I'll be able to interpolate between them so that I can make the correct predictions. It's just what you're saying, Niels. It's not a dense model, but it's got a lot of points in it, a lot of stored points.
Yeah.
So, that's a general problem.
Yeah. Anyways, I just thought that was a bit of kind of like a small elephant in the room to maybe think more about as well.
And I've argued before that even our morphology model has the same problem. We sample much more densely than we really should. And so we've just been avoiding it.
I mean, at least in that case, we're hoping hierarchy. Well, it's probably not an either or. I feel like hierarchy and interpolation are both.
Right. Well, hierarchy certainly helps a great deal, right? Yes. I mean, you could argue that maybe you could take a problem and you break it into lots and lots and lots of hierarchical components, and that would be more efficient. But then you have a lot more of storage of data in the hierarchy. So there's no free lunch here, right?
Right.
So I think you're right. The hierarchy is going to be a big component of it, but interpolation is going to be a component to it. It just feels like it has to be. And I'm not worried about that too much because I think we can get the interpolation part to work. But I agree with your point though. Hierarchy is going to be an important component of this. All right, well, I'm jazzed up to think about this. Let's hope I can keep self-focused on
Sorry,
it.
I didn't want to just present the whole meeting again.
That's all right.
I didn't even plan on making slides, but then I felt like with like a composition object, it's easy to just draw it on a whiteboard or whatever during the meeting. But with behaviors, I feel like I need this temporal component to show what I mean. So then I decided to make some animations, and I decided, I need to make some more slides to explain them.
Well,
and it ended up
the animations are nice. I don't know how you did the one with the hand-drawn staple. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, I loved the like Walt Disney style stapler. I was like,
Yeah,
I'm sitting here thinking like, oh my God, am I getting too old? Do I have to learn how to do this? You know, this is the new requirement. Like, oh shit, I mean, I don't even know where to begin on that. Rami did some amazing stuff in PowerPoint. I don't know, you did. That was
yeah.
incredible.
Last time I made them all with After Effects, but it's like such a complex program. So then I was
You
talking
said
with
you used,
Will the other day how like 15 years ago there was this really easy program, and we found a similar one that's just like a web interface. And so I tried using that today. It doesn't have all the features I wanted it to have, but it worked reasonably well.
oh gosh. All right, I'm gonna try to work on this.